Welcome to Navigating Consumer and Family Law Challenges. Insights from SoCal's trusted attorneys.
Hello and welcome to Navigating Consumer and Family Law Challenges. Insights from SoCal's trusted attorneys with Amanda Hill and Sara Khosroabadi. With a focus on family law, consumer protection, and employment law, Amanda and Sara offer helpful, caring, and professional legal services and advice. I am your host, Kevin Rosenquist, and today's episode is When Duty Meets Divorce, the Complexities of Military Family Law Matters. Great to have you guys back. Welcome.
Thanks, Kevin. Good to be back.
So let's get started. What unique challenges do military families face when going through a divorce, especially if one or both spouses are stationed overseas?
Yeah, I mean, obviously the basics, right? Are they going to have access to Wi-Fi? Are they going to have even the ability to participate in the process? What are their military duties going to be, and how are they going to impact their ability to go through the legal proceeding? It obviously causes a lot of complexity when it comes to figuring out a shared parenting plan and whether it's going to be feasible for there to be traveling between two different households. So yeah, I mean, it definitely can make a huge impact compared to a civilian family who doesn't have those special needs.
How does military service impact the divorce proceedings themselves, particularly in the division of assets like military pensions and benefits and whatnot?
Yeah, so I mean, people who are in the military, they have access to certain benefits that others may not. So for example, depending on how many years of service they provide, they may have access to a pension. They may have access to what's called a specific federal plan of a 401k called a TSP account, medical benefits, post-service VA benefits, right? So all of that is going to come into play at time of legal separation or divorce. And as to the entitlements for the spouse, it's really going to depend on how many years overlap with the years of service and years of marriage.
Okay. Yeah, it seems like it's so much more complicated for a military couple to try to, even if only one of them is in the military. I mean, is there a sense that it's better to try to wait until you're at least in this country, in the state,
Honestly, I think with the increase in the ability to use technology, it really depends, right? Like if you're in a battle zone, yeah, probably, it's not going to make sense and there's might be a stay in the proceedings. But if you're in Italy and you're stationed there, or you're in Japan, which a lot of our Navy members get stationed there for a certain period of time, it's usually pretty easy to have access to the ability to communicate. And everything's virtual now since COVID-19. They even allow for court appearances to be held virtually, and depending on which county you reside. So for example, San Diego County uses the Teams application, but Riverside County uses Zoom application for court appearances. So even the courts are using technology to allow for people not located, locally to be able to still participate in proceedings.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, I guess we do have lots of ways to communicate these days, talk to people all over the country. All over the world. So yeah, I guess that's a good point. What are the specific considerations for child custody and visitation in military divorce cases, especially when one parent is frequently deployed or relocated?
Yeah, so I mean, there's two different layers to that. So in general, even when military families are not going through a legal proceeding like a divorce or legal separation, if they're about to go on deployment, there's a family care plan that gets put into place with their command. And everybody is aware of, if God forbid something were to happen to somebody, what is the care plan, right? And there's always second in charge. Is there, additional guardians that would step into the place if the one spouse that's left behind also is unavailable? So those care plans get put into place before the deployment takes place. But in addition, let's say it's two separate households and there's military members and they've already been separated for years, but one of the parents is about to go on deployment. Same thing, those things get navigated as far as figuring out, is the other spouse, even if they don't have 50-50 custody with the other parent, going to be able to take more custody during the temporary deployment that takes place? Again, too, if it's the early onset of a divorce proceeding and there's a deployment that takes place, sometimes what happens is just kind of the default of the one that remains stateside is going to be the one that primarily takes care of the children if they're able to do so. But it does take a lot more planning. And sometimes I do see that there's certain applications that the military members can put in when they know that they're going through this legal process and they haven't figured out a parenting plan yet, they sometimes can put in for a request for a delay of a deployment, but that really is on a case-by-case basis. So it depends on, what they're going for the deployment for. Sometimes, it can't be delayed and they do need to go.
I know a lot of states have some fairly strict laws as far as relocating goes when you're in a co-parenting situation. My wife was a self-proclaimed Navy brat. Her dad was in the Navy, and she was all over the place. I mean, she all around the South all the time. I mean, they have to. There's special situations there, so they have to kind of loosen some of those rules. Is that fair assessment?
Unfortunately, in the state of California, not really. The only special treatment they can get is there's something called an order shortening time. So if you can show proof and documentation that there's an upcoming deployment, or all of a sudden there's a need for someone to be somewhere else very quickly, then you can go in on an ex parte basis or an emergency basis and ask for a hearing set for the court to adjudicate that issue quicker than normal, like a normal set hearing. That's really only the special treatment that they would get. Of course, that only applies when, the parents can't reach an agreement outside of court.
Good point. Yeah.
Right. So, I mean, sure, the hope is that they don't have to end up in court, but there is that special procedure if they need it. But I mean, for example, I had a case one time where I went to court 3 different times for a parent for a move away because of 3 different relocations that happens from Hawaii to San Diego to Texas. So each time, of course, the hope is that the other parent is going to be reasonable and agree and allow for the move and sign an agreement, and you don't have to go to court. But in that particular case, we had to go to court every time.
Sarah, how does the Service Members Civil Relief Act, or the SCRA, protect military members?
Yeah, there are a few different protections that it provides, actually, and some of them are for pre-military obligations, and some of them are even while you're in the military. So, for instance, the credit cards, most credit cards right now have anywhere between 17% to 29% interest rates on them. The SCRA actually caps that interest rate at 6% if the debt was acquired before their military start, so before they started in the military. So that's really helpful because you can cap that military interest rate, especially when you're on deployment, to 6% instead of paying the 29%. That's one example of when the SCRA comes into play before you joined the military. A couple other things that the SCRA provides for is, for instance, while you're in the military, there actually has to be, especially here in California, a declaration stating that you've looked to make sure that that defendant or that other party is not in the military before you default them. And if you default them without checking off that box or making sure that they aren't in the military, the party who tries to default them can actually get into trouble for that. So it protects against default judgments, meaning you weren't able to actually respond or have your day in court. So that's a nice protection for service members. It also allows for financial things, like you can get out of an apartment lease while you're in the military, especially if you're on a deployment or you're getting moved to a different duty station. Automobile leases, same thing. If you're getting shipped from San Diego to Japan and you can't really take that car, you actually can get out of that lease as well. There's a whole slew of them as far as what the SCRA does, more so like deferred income taxes, like I mentioned, eviction protections as well. So it's a pretty good statute that was in place to protect our military members while they're off, protecting our rights and our civil liberties. We can at least protect them a little bit on the consumer and financial side.
Yeah, I can't imagine anybody would protest that. That's for sure. In military divorce cases, are there any times people remain married but legally separate? And what are the pros and cons of doing so?
Yeah, so I've had it on several instances where and in fact, sometimes it's most beneficial when both spouses are in the active duty military, but let's say they're both up for recontract to get a new contract, which usually happens about every 3 years, but they're in the middle of separating. So they choose to do a legal separation instead of a divorce for several reasons. They want to remain in the same locale, especially if they have children, right? So if they're sharing children, they don't want to have one parent get shipped off to, the East Coast and the other one remain on the West Coast, because that's going to cause, some more difficulty in an already very difficult situation. And, they want to continue to have the benefits as well of being a married unit, as far as the benefits they receive for salary purposes as well. But of course, the cons are they're still married. So if they want to start a new relationship, there are military laws in place that still are in play. right? There's infidelity laws that don't necessarily come into play for California because California is a no-fault state, but they are still actively in play for, complying with what the military says you have to do while you're active duty. And in addition, if you ever change your mind that you now want to fully get divorced because you've met somebody else, you have to start the whole process over. So you get a legal separation judgment, and maybe everything has been divided as far as assets and debts, and you've come up with the parenting plan if you share children. But in order to be deemed a single person again, you will have to file additional paperwork with the court.
Okay. Boy, that sounds like there's the cons outweigh the pros for that a little bit.
One thing that I would add is sometimes when, let's say, there's only one military spouse and one is a civilian, there are pretty good medical benefits as well, that maybe there's an upcoming surgery that's going to take place, right? And they were the supported spouse and they don't have employment yet, but they're going through this divorce. They may delay the proceedings or do a legal separation to allow for them to continue to receive those benefits. Because once they're deemed divorced and no longer married to the military member, they can no longer have access to those benefits in most circumstances. So that's one thing that can come into play as far as benefiting the non-military spouse.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense for sure. What impact does a deployment or a permanent change of station, sometimes called a PCS, have on a child custody arrangement and the child support payments?
Yeah, so depending on where they're being relocated to, so the way the military pay scale works, they have their BAS pay, which is their salary pay, but they also get the benefit of what's called BAH, or basic housing allowance. And that is specific to the locale of where they are. So for example, if you're in San Diego, the cost of living is much higher, your BAH is going to be higher. If you're in, a smaller town in Texas or in the Midwest, your BAH is going to be lower because the cost of living is lower. So depending on where you're changing your location to, that is going to impact potentially, what the support numbers are going to look like, because BAH is considered in California part of the child support calculation. It's considered non-taxable income on the side of the ledger for the military member. So that can impact the numbers and what the support figure looks like. It's also going to have an impact, right, on how logistically the parenting schedule is going to look like, because if at one point they're living together within a couple of miles or up to 20, 30 miles of each other, and now they're living across the country, a 50-50 sharing plan is probably not going to be practical, right? Especially if the children are in school. So that has to be reevaluated, and what is practical and what's going to be best for the children.
Yeah, good points for sure. Sarah, what steps can military spouses take to protect their financial interests when going through a divorce, especially if they are back here when their partner is deployed?
So in California, since it is a community property state, any of the assets that they get, any pay that the military member makes is going to still be considered community property while they're married or while they're together. So some things that they can definitely take into consideration if they are going through the divorce, it's a little bit of a different situation, but there is oftentimes military housing. You won't necessarily get kicked out of military housing just because you're going through a divorce. It's important to remember that there is an obligation for the military member, if they do have the housing, that they keep that in place for them, for the spouse that's here. Another thing is they want to really keep good records of any accounts that they have, whether it be their checking accounts, savings accounts, the debt that they have. Oftentimes when the military member is abroad, especially if they're in a zone where they can't really respond, it's hard to get those documents from them while you're going through the divorce. So you want to have access to any kind of statements that you can beforehand, before the person goes on deployment. You want to make sure that there is good communication if possible. Sometimes it's just not possible in a divorce, but if it is possible, then you want to have those discussions before the military member goes on those deployments. And then you really want to understand what your expenses are. Just because you can stay in military housing doesn't mean that's going to be something that you can do for the long run. So what does it cost to stay in San Diego, for instance, or in that same location? Are you planning on moving outside of the state? Oftentimes, military marriages bring a spouse to somewhere that they probably would have never been in the first place. So if you want to go back home, what does that look like? How does that impact the divorce as well? And especially if you have children. And then lastly, I would say it's really important. It's kind of like a last case scenario if it's really getting dire, but since that military member is still in the military, there is a responsibility that they are financially providing for children and for spouses. So if you have to get the command involved, you might be able to, but it's really should be like a last resort type of thing.
Okay. And as we wrap up here, obviously there's going to be a lot more that we're going to get into in future episodes, but as a general rule, when would you say is the best time to hire your firm when it comes to dealing with any divorce?
So I always think that if you're contemplating it, I definitely feel like you should consult with an attorney. Even if you're not ready to actually file, you should know what it's going to look like for you, because it is a process. It doesn't happen overnight. In the state of California, it takes a minimum of 6 months to get a divorce. And usually there's going to be some extensive delays if you do have a military member as one of the spouses. So it's important to kind of plan ahead, get your finances in order, start, Sarah likes to use the word squirreling away a little money if you can, if you can financially afford to do it, to start planning and figuring out what it's going to look like, what your options are. Another thing I always advise people is to figure out who your confidants are going to be through the process, because you don't want the whole world to know. It's certainly not something you want to be blasting over social media, but
you shouldn't anyway.
No, shouldn't.
I've seen it done.
Yes. Keeps us busy, right? But definitely figuring out who your handful or less of people who you're going to be able to lean on during the very stressful process of going through divorce.
And Sarah, I think it's one of those things too, like I've heard this from lawyers in all sorts of different areas. Like every case is unique, and so trying to go and get your own advice on social media, on the internet, with a friend, with a family member, it's not you're not talking apples to apples. So it's important to talk to somebody who can understand your case and give you some advice.
Yeah, absolutely. Another small caveat I have is oftentimes military members and their spouses go to legal on base, and nothing against legal on base, but sometimes they don't give the most accurate advice as far as what needs to happen in California specifically. So it is important to reach out to attorneys out in the city that you're in so that you can get the best information, because those attorneys are really in the courtrooms, and they're the ones that are dealing with those matters with the judges that we have here in San Diego, specifically, or Riverside, for instance. So it's important for that too. But yeah, I agree with you. One of our core values is educating clients. And we think it's really important for them to know what is going on, why it's going on. At the end of the day, it's their divorce. It's their lives that are going to be impacted. And our goal is to make sure that they know what's going to happen and when it's going to happen for them. So
that's very, very well said. Well, thank you for joining us on Navigating Consumer and Family Law Challenges, Insights from SoCal's Trusted Attorneys with Amanda Hill and Sara Khosroabadi. To connect with their firm, visit kandhlawgroup.com. And please be sure to like and subscribe to our channel and leave us a review in the comments. Sarah, Amanda, great to see you again. Thanks so much for being here.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks. Bye.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to hit that like and subscribe button and leave us a review in the comments.